All right, so the two chapters that you should have gone through for yesterday were both really short ones, so it was a good day to kind of catch up. The first chapter that you guys were assigned yesterday was chapter 9. So, chapter 9 is actually the last chapter where Bernard and Lenina and John and Linda are still at the Savage Reservation. And in one sense, it's kind of a transitional chapter because it's so quick. But what it does do, aside from being a transition, kind of showing us that they're going to be leaving this place, is it actually kind of advances and gives us some more ideas about how John feels about Lenina. So previously in chapter 7, when John saw Lenina, he was instantly struck. This was on page 117 and 118 for those of you in the book. She smiles at him and he notices how beautiful that she is. So we almost know that for someone that doesn't come from the society of conditioning, John is falling in love with Lenina. So in chapter 9, Lenina ends up taking Soma because this terrible, tough day on the reservation, while Bernard goes on to make all of the necessary phone calls and things to be able to get John and Linda to come back to the New World. And he actually pitches it not as what it really is, which is blackmail, so that he doesn't get transferred by the DHC, but he pitches it as sufficient scientific research. So, in one of our discussions yesterday, somebody asked a question of, why the world controllers would allow certain things to happen. Why would they allow John and Linda to come back? Well, that's a really good question, and that's something that you should remember here. They're going to be allowed to bring these outsiders back who are not going to fit in. We can almost certainly agree with that. So, what purpose would Mustafa Mond or the other world controllers have in allowing people like John and Linda to come back to civilization? So anyway, back to chapter 9. As Bernard is off making all of these arrangements and Lenina is kind of passed out on Soma holiday, John ends up approaching the house on the Pueblo where Lenina and Bernard were staying, and he knocks and he finds that nobody answers. This causes him a lot of distress, and he basically convinces himself that they've abandoned him, that it was a false hope. But then he kind of peers in a window and he sees Lenina's bag. It's still there. So he breaks a window and enters. Now, some people see the end of this chapter as being kind of creepy based on what John does next, but it's not meant to be interpreted as creepy. In fact, a motif that was mentioned earlier, John having the memory that Pope gave him this book of Shakespeare's completed works, and how John uses Shakespeare to kind of convey the emotions that he doesn't understand. We see that happening again in this chapter. So even though John does weird things like breaks into the window and starts going through her bag and touching her clothes and zipping and unzipping the zippers on her clothes, not the ones she's wearing, um, it's almost as if he's channeling Romeo and Juliet. So he has some of these different lines that he remembers from Romeo and Juliet. Should I profane her thus with a touch of my hand? Um, and he reaches out to touch her, and looks down and remembers that he doesn't have that right. So he becomes ashamed of himself. Even though he knows that all it would take was one flick of his wrist and he could unzip the things that she's wearing. So the fact that he doesn't do this starts to establish that John has a deep adoration for Lenina. He's putting her on a pedestal already. He's imagining her like this Juliet, this pure virginal figure. And unfortunately, he's going to come to the stark realization that she's actually the opposite. She is not a virgin and she is not pure. He adores her for what he thinks she must be or that she might be. When essentially he is in for a big heartache when he realizes that Lenina is actually just like what his mother, Linda, once was, and that her way of life is one of the reasons for the problems that he's had his entire life. So that's how we leave chapter 9. Now, chapter 10 brings us back to civilization. In chapter 10, it kind of cuts back to the DHC. So Bernard is not kind of leading the narration here. The DHC and Henry Foster, they are waiting for Bernard to arrive for a meeting. And they've planned this meeting to be very public, filled with all other high caste workers in the fertilizing room. So there's a couple of different symbols here. On the one hand, they want all these other high caste workers to be around because this is going to serve as a caution or a warning. If you start acting, in a way that doesn't fit the rest of society, unorthodox is the word that they keep using over and over again. then this is kind of a warning of what could happen to them. They'll be transferred. What's also interesting is when we figure out what is going to happen, what Bernard is going to present the DHC with is they're in the fertilizing room. This is where babies are made. So the irony there is going to kind of pop out. According to Henry Foster, as the DHC is kind of rambling on to him, the loss of one person isn't a big deal because another can just be made, and that in society is what really matters. So, another idea reinforced here is the idea that the individual isn't what is important, but it's society, the bigger body, right? Um, all right. So, as he's gearing up for his speech, the director on page 148 of your book says, "The greater a man's talents, the greater his power to lead astray. It is better that one should suffer than that many should be corrupted. Consider the matter disproportionately, Mr. Foster, and you will see that no offense is so heinous as unorthodoxy of all. What is an individual?" So, in other words, in his mind, Bernard has committed the highest possible crime. Bernard then enters the room, the fertilization room, in a ridiculous manner. He's full of this bravado. He's speaking too loudly. He's being too bold. So he kind of creates a caricature of himself, more of this little man syndrome. And as he enters, the director lists off his unorthodox behavior. He's an enemy of society. He's a subverter of order and stability. He is a conspirator against civilization. He has heretical views on Soma. He has an unorthodox sex life, and he has a refusal to obey the teachings of Ford. So he kind of lumps all of these things on. And in the end, he asks Bernard if he can think of any reason why he should not be sentenced as far from society as possible to Iceland. And not like the contemporary basic view of Iceland, but like in this time it would have been like a land of ice and a barren place. And just when he asks him this question, Bernard brings in Linda and John. Now, the reaction that people have to the two different individuals is significant. Linda, who, remember her appearance, she's this big, fat, sloppy, she hasn't been taking care of herself, so she's wrinkly, she's missing teeth, she's dirty. She addresses the director as Tomakin, or Tom as his name is, and she embraces him loudly. So she goes up and gives him a hug, which is not something that people in this society do. Because she's so ugly, people watching, all of these other high caste workers, take this as a joke until she brings up kind of this taboo subject and she says, "You made me have a baby." And it goes awkwardly silent. So when John enters, standing very straight and strong and proud, and calls him father, the people, it kind of breaks the tension and causes them to laugh again. We could really look into this and say, well, it's unfair treatment. It's a double standard. Linda gets treated poorly when she brings up that Tomakin caused her to have a baby, and it's kind of disgusting. It's one of those things that you just never bring up. And then when John says, "You're my father," it's more of, they let him off the hook. But we don't have to get in to that too much. So hopefully you can appreciate the irony here that the DHC met Linda in the fertilizing room where she used to work and where they met, and it was actually his fertilization of her that caused this whole situation. We see a control shift here. The first few chapters, the DHC is the man in control, the world state is a society in control. As soon as John enters the picture, though, he is a savage. His entire life is out of control, and now people's fortunes start to be reversed. So the director is, in fact, chased out and laughed at and really never heard from again. All right, so in chapter 11, we start to get an idea of what society or civilization is like for John. Everyone wants to meet him. Linda is largely ignored because, one, she's ugly, and two, she called herself a mother. And three, they don't really see her as a real savage. She was born in a bottle just like everybody else. And as far as other people are concerned, and Linda is concerned, she's okay with this because Linda, what society and a return to civilization mean are truly just a return to Soma. So she tried to cope all of these years by drinking the mezcal, and now she's back taking up to 20 grams a day of Soma, which will, according to the doctor, finish her off in about a month. John objects to this ultimately, but he's forced to give in when the doctor's rationale is explained to him. If you're in the book on page 154, he says every Soma holiday is a bit of an eternity. So the doctor's reaction to Linda, he's glad to study her. He's not worried that he can't rejuvenate her and that in about a month the soma will essentially overdose and cause her to, shut down her organs. And this kind of shows a lack of emotions and humanity when compared to John's concern. Obviously, this is his mother, and he kind of continues to argue that it's not right. Meanwhile, for those of you that are using Bernard as part of your hero's journey, we see that he is in this world of the unknown now. He is starting to reap the benefits of John's presence. He is treated not only normally, but as a person of great importance. So, unlike before, women are now interested in him. He is popular in society. And the person that he uses as a sounding board for all of this new success is Helmholtz. Helmholtz, meanwhile, laments the fact that he lost his old friend Bernard. So, the grumpy guy that was keen on talking with him and kind of sharing these insights. Bernard chalks this kind of sadness up to jealousy, and he vows never to see Helmholtz again. So, maybe these are some of the challenges and temptations that occur on Bernard's hero's journey. He also kind of starts to dig himself a little bit of a hole because remember, having John and Linda in this society is scientific research. So he sends in reports to Mustafa Mond and he becomes a little too self important when composing these. Mustafa Mond begins to become annoyed with him and kind of says that he's going to take care of him eventually. This will ironically be the beginning of Bernard's downfall. All of his early moral thoughts are pushed aside and he's turning into somewhat of a hypocrite. Um, like Bernard himself is acting these days, all of the popularity is not genuine. As we see, even though women want to sleep with him and he's invited to all of these high society parties, people still talk about him and they actually loathe him more than ever before. Um, One of the things that happens on John's tour of the civilization is that Bernard shows John a helicopter factory, and this is somewhere where it's menial labor here. So the entire factory is operated by a set of identical twins. Remember, these would be from the lower castes. And upon seeing all of these people that look exactly the same that are performing this menial task, John mutters the phrase of the book, which is our title, "O Brave New World," which makes him physically sick. So, this is the second time that the title of the book has come up. The first one was when John was still on the Savage Reservation. And when he first muttered the words, "O Brave New World," it was kind of this hopeful exclamation. In the part of, to give you just a little bit of background, this is a quote from Shakespeare's play The Tempest. And in The Tempest, there's a wizard who lives on an island and he has a beautiful daughter. And essentially, he causes this great storm, this tempest that drives in these ships from these different places to all kind of crash land on this island. And for his daughter, Miranda, who has never seen another human being before, she's only been on this island with her wizard father. The first time she sees one of the beautiful men who gets off on one of these shipwrecked boats, um, and she engages with them. I think they're playing a game, like checkers or something. She mutters, "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it," and it's kind of almost as like a an exclamation of "Thank goodness, this is a new place and there are such wonderful people." So it's an awestruck kind of phrase. So the first time John mutters, "Oh, brave new world," it's in response to this opportunity that he's being given. The second time that he mutters, "Oh, brave new world," he sees all of these twins working in this factory and it's disgusting to him. So his illusion, this big buildup of this idea of civilization he had in his head, is going to start to crack because it's no longer an awestruck in a positive way when he says, "Oh, brave new world," but it's more in a negative way. The next place that John is taken by Bernard is to a school. He takes him to Eton, which is actually a real school in England, a very high class school. And what he witnesses is a Malthusian drill, which is all of the girls learning to take their contraceptive. And another room shows a group of children laughing at a video of a religious ceremony, which is akin to what happened on the Savage Reservation. The Native Americans are whipping themselves. John sees also that the library has only reference books, so there's no literature, there's no Shakespeare. Remember, there's no solitary activities that are encouraged in this society. On a cutover, we find that Lenina has also become very popular since their return. She is being had by more important men than she was being had with before. but she's excited for a date with John. So Bernard kind of makes this date with the headmistress of Eton and asks Lenina to watch John, almost like a babysitter. And this excitement we see in Lenina, despite the fact that she's kind of fallen into her old ways, those of you studying her for the hero's journey, she is excited because she might be developing feelings for John as well. What ends up happening on their date? She takes him to a feely, which would be like an equivalent of a movie theater, but instead of just seeing the movie, they would have other sensory things involved in the movie as well. So you could maybe smell things that were happening in the movie. Maybe they could trigger tastes. Your hands go on these two like orbs that also can help you feel some of the things in the movie as well. So what they find is that the plot of the movie is essentially about a woman who is taken hostage by a Negro and rescued by three alphas, and then she has sex with all of them. It is basically a pornographic film, and since it is highly interactive and everyone has their hands on these little orbs, everyone leaves, we'll just say, quote unquote, very satisfied because they experience all of the sensations that the characters in the movie would experience as well. So while everyone else knows this feely is business as usual, John is horrified and humiliated that Lenina might enjoy something like that. So he does not sleep with her as she hopes at the end, but instead, when he gets out of her helicopter, he goes to his room and instead of reading Romeo and Juliet, he reads Othello. So, for those of you that don't know the plot behind Othello versus Romeo and Juliet, Othello is about a man and a woman who are married, and the husband becomes incredibly jealous of when a rumor is planted that his wife is cheating on him, and he eventually kills her because she is a whore. Um, One play that John associates with Lenina at this point, Romeo and Juliet, is about innocent young love. But we see now here that his feelings might be changing because the story he chooses to read, Othello, is about betrayal and jealousy and suspicion. All right, the final chapter that you will read hopefully before Monday is chapter 12. And in chapter 12, Bernard is hosting a lot of notable people are going to show up. And essentially, he's been exploiting John and using him as kind of bait to get other people to come over. So, this party that he has is just so people can meet the savage. So, that's why they're coming, not because they actually like Bernard. However, because this is after his kind of disastrous date with Lenina, John has locked himself in his room and will not come out. He gets so mad that Bernard keeps asking him to come out that he begins yelling in Zuni. So we see again when John is faced with emotions that he cannot understand on his own. Shakespeare maybe isn't working for him, English isn't working for him, so he goes into this other influence that he's had in his life, which is the Native American influence. So, just as John's illusion of the New World, of civilization, is crashing down because of what happened with Lenina and the tour that he was taken on, unfortunately, now Bernard's euphoric world will also begin to crash down. Bernard ends up having to announce to all of his guests that the savage will not come out, and people begin talking about him and being rude to him, this time not behind his back, but in the room. So all of the old rumors are back, and soon everybody leaves. Lenina, who showed up with this very, very important person, this arch community songster, she follows him somewhat zombie like out of the party. Um, and we see the change that's happened in Lenina. Um, on page 174, Lenina wants to talk to him. She's very enamored with John, and she's beginning to feel physically ill. She has an emotion she's never felt before, and she can't quite recognize her feelings. Essentially, what she's beginning to feel is true love or emotion for the first time. She wants to talk to John. She's not taken any soma, and we're not quite sure what she wants to hear back from him. On page 177, as she's following this arch community songster out, there's a quote that says, Lenina, who had lingered for a moment to look at the moon, dropped her eyes and came hurrying across the room to rejoin him. So, again, those of you that are kind of tracking the hero's journey, this idea that she stops quickly to look up at the moon kind of shows that she's growing, because before, the last time that we saw a character looking up at the moon just to kind of think and reflect, it was when Bernard took Lenina on a date and stopped the helicopter above the English Channel, and she refused to do so. So her having this one little action where she looks up at the moon kind of shows us that she's changed from who she was before. All right, just another little thing to take note of. Bernard and the others call John the Savage or Mr. Savage, but Lenina calls him John. She refers to him as John using his personal name. And so this also shows kind of her emotions, how they're deepening. Later on, John is reading Romeo and Juliet in his room, so it appears that he's trying to forget the Othello version of Lenina, and he's reading Romeo and Juliet is almost like he's self-conditioning himself. He's had to create his own belief system since he was denied the initiation at Malpace, right, the Vision Quest. In another scene, we flash to Mustafa Mond. He's declining a book for publication because the ideas in it, while they're brilliant, they're dangerous to society. On page 177, it says, "It was the sort of idea that might easily decondition the more unsettled minds of the higher castes, make them lose their faith and take to believing that the goal was somewhere beyond, somewhere outside the present human sphere. The purpose of life was." He also puts this writer on watch for transference. So, just in this little scene, we as the readers can understand the ultimate control that Mustafa Mond has. He is a world controller, quite literally. He censors things and can decide the fate of an individual at any other time. So, what this tells us is that, number one, unorthodoxy, or kind of having these differing beliefs from society, is pretty much the worst thing that you can do. It's the biggest crime. But it also kind of brings us back to this question of why would he allow John and Linda to be here in the first place? What's the goal? Okay. At the end of this chapter, Bernard and Helmholtz reconcile. Helmholtz was generous in his forgiveness, which enrages Bernard, right? Why is he such a good guy? And we learn that recently Helmholtz came under fire with the authorities after a lecture he gave on advanced emotional engineering. Essentially, he read a poem to them. On page 80, he says, "I wanted to do a bit of propaganda. I was trying to engineer them into feelings as I'd felt when I wrote the rhymes." So he wrote this poem that was essentially about being alone, and um, he's trying to write about emotions and feelings, which would be considered highly unorthodox. Um, Meanwhile, Helmholtz finally gets to meet John, and they have an immediate connection, partly because of his poems, and they just start bonding together. John ends up reading Shakespeare to him, which shows, because Helmholtz, how he considers it, the effect that John is having on other people. So John is affecting Lenina in that she is kind of falling in love with him. He's affecting Helmholtz by encouraging him with his poetry and reading him Shakespeare, showing him other poetry. Bernard, in a very kind of childish way, his reaction is wanting revenge and assigning blame to everybody else um, but himself. So we're starting to see that Bernard is one of the most superficial of all the characters in the book. And that brings us to the end of chapter 12.